Hello, everybody. Today is day 195, and we are diving into an unfamiliar book for most people, the book of Micah, and the first 7 chapters. Interesting that many of these small books actually are very prophetic, and in their prophecy, it's not only dealing with their current events, but is also projecting forward, and they become a prophetic word pertaining to eschatology or last things. And so in this book, we've got references to issues that are going on with Israel at that time. It also references to the coming of Jesus the first time, references to the latter days when Jesus returns, and even the millennial reign and the Battle of Armageddon. So all of this is chucked in this little book here, and I'm just going to skim over it and just highlight certain things. Though Micah is primarily a prophet to Judah, his book also deals with Samaria and Gentile nations because it's going to impact everybody with what God is revealing here. He's reproving not just Israel, but all of them for their sins and their wickedness, warning of the impending judgment that is coming and the captivity of Israel. He also deals with the future, and he sees and declares the future restoration of the kingdom by the Messiah and the great events of the latter days. Now, God warned Israel many times what would befall them, and that pertains to both kingdoms if they continued in their sins and in their defiant rebellion and their backslidden state. Now, this is what comes out again and again. It becomes very repetitious and maybe even monotonous, but it does demonstrate God's long suffering and his desire to give them every opportunity, every chance. God has become less tolerant of them as we read this from the prophet Micah. He makes mention of their mock worship. He talks about their ritualism and their sins and their dead formalities, and then to invoke the judgment terms of the Mosaic covenant. This is what God begins to reveal through Micah. He's obligated to do that. He cannot wink nor just ignore this. So he formulates a plan that would eventually bring them back to repentance. And this is always God's objective. If God were to immediately cut off and judge, then there would be no recourse for restoration. But this is God's concern all along. And by so doing, he's going to be fulfilling his everlasting covenants that he has made, and because God cannot lie. But he's going to do it on righteous terms, not just simply to accomplish what he had promised. Now, in the first 3 chapters of Micah, we have God's case against Israel, with predictions of coming judgments, making reference of their captivity, and the fact that they're going to be dispersed around to other nations, and then a promise of a coming blessing to the remnant. And so that remnant theology comes out again. And so I want you to hang on to that, because that's applicable to us today. Much of what we see in reference to the Israel nation is also applicable to us today as the new Israel, and the fact that we also are experiencing the vicious cycles of rebellion and sin and lukewarmness. And so remember that as God judged Israel, he also will judge the church. Judgment begins in the house of God, the Bible tells us, and then he's going to, a righteous remnant will rise up. And so all of this kind of correlates together. It's really quite fascinating. Now, that's what we find in the first 3 chapters. Now, in chapters 4 and 5 of Micah, deals mainly with the millennium, with a reference to the Babylonian captivity, and then the first advent or coming of the Messiah, which we know as the coming of Jesus. Isn't it fascinating that several hundred years before the coming of Jesus, Micah is prophetically describing in detail elements of this. But it's followed by God having, in these chapters, to give up on Israel to dispersion among the nations until the second advent or coming of Christ. So recognize that has not yet been fulfilled. And so, but we are seeing the regathering of the Jews back to their homeland. And so we've been watching this occur now for the last several decades, which it's culminating. And so all of this is exciting because it points to the very things that Micah is warning about. And in fact, he makes mention of that in chapters 4 and 5 of the war, Messiah war with the Antichrist at the time he comes to restore Israel. So Israel will be restored. That will occur when the Messiah returns. And then in chapters 6 and 7, God takes up his case against Israel again. And finally, the book ends with latter-day events when God's covenant with Abraham will be performed. All of this is a word of encouragement for us, but also a word of warning. Because while we're the Gentile, they're being blessed by God, we are provoking Israel to jealousy. This is the plan of God. And yet at the same time, we are witnessing what Jesus prophesied, a great falling away. And while that's occurring, though, then things are being put in place to where God will fulfill completely his covenant with Abraham, and the Jewish people will be restored back. They'll recognize that Jesus is the Messiah, and we'll see an incredible conversion of Jews coming to Jesus, and we then can be witnesses of that, and why it's so important for you and I to hold true to the gospel and don't waver and don't allow the darkness of this hour to dim your light for Jesus.